Hi everyone. Today we're going to be learning about comma rules. And so if you have not done your no red ink assignment on commas first, I do want you to pause this video and go back and do that initially because that's going to tell me what we already know about commas, so we don't waste time later in the week going over that. So make sure you do that no red ink assignment first on commas. And if you've already done that, you can have out your piece of Cornell Notes paper, and we're going to go ahead and get started on comma rules. I do want to make sure that everyone is listening carefully to the video because we are doing this video since we're running out of class time. So I need you to listen carefully and not just skip through. I will be checking your notes to see if they are thorough on Monday. So on our Cornell Notes, our topic and objective for today is comma rules, and we're going to talk about 9 different ways commas can be used correctly in writing. And just as a reminder, this is obviously on colons and semicolons, but we want to set up our grammar notes typically with the rule in the left column and maybe some examples or details in the right column. So I'm going to kind of just go through the video and the examples. Please feel free, and I will be checking for this in your notes, that you have probably at some times paused the video to write down different examples, okay? So our first thing we're going to talk about are introductory clauses and phrases. And so the rule there is that you have to use a comma to show a pause after a clause or phrase when it begins the sentence. So let me give you some examples of that. If I were to say something like, running at top speed, Jean chased down the school bus, that's that introductory phrase that we do need a pause after it. And those are kind of just those things that you hear naturally to introduce the sentence. Be careful though, because sometimes, particularly if those phrases are at the end of the sentence, you don't need a comma. So like Magnus enjoys running at top speed. We don't need a comma there, there's not a pause. It's typically only when that clause or phrase is starting the sentence. The second way that we use commas are front themos, which we've been kind of using those as transition words. That's another way you can think of them. And so the rule here is that when a transition word, such as therefore, however, also, moreover, otherwise, etc., there are a bunch of them on the next slide. Whenever one of those words comes between two independent clauses, and they might be separate sentences or they might be joined by a semicolon, but whenever it comes between those, you use a comma after that transition word. So for example, down here, if I said, Dave likes bananas, period. However, that's one of our themos or transition words, comma, he wasn't in the mood for one today. Okay, so again, those transition words, even if they're in the middle of a sentence, even if this were a semicolon, we use a comma after it because that's kind of almost like an introductory word for the sentence. It's that transition word, and we need a little pause after it. So there are some common themos down here, and in addition to your example sentence, I would maybe write a few of those down so you kind of get the pattern and you know what to look for there. Our third comma rule is also with themos, or those same transition words, but it's about when they occur in the middle of a sentence. So when a transition word, like the ones we've talked about, interrupts a single thought or independent clause, you place commas on both sides of it. Okay? And that's your rule you can write down. Here's an example at the top. If I said it was time for dessert, Aria, however, didn't want an ice cream cone. Notice that that last part, Aria didn't want an ice cream cone, is all one single thought, independent clause, one sentence. The themo is coming, however, is coming in the middle of that independent clause. So we're not going to use something like a semicolon or a period because that's all just one sentence. But typically, a themo or those transition words show some kind of shift in an idea. So we have to put the commas around it to give our reader a little pause. Aria, however, didn't want one, okay? Our next rule is about using commas in a compound sentence. And so hopefully you all already kind of know this rule, but this is going to be a refresher from our sentence types lesson. So the rule is that when a sentence has the pattern independent clause plus a fanboys word plus another independent clause, you have to put a comma before the fanboys word. So for example, and this is the correct example right here, I bought cupcakes for the party. That's a complete thought. And my sister made confetti. My sister made confetti is also a complete thought. So we've got two independent clauses. They're connected by that fanboys. So again, that's that pattern we always see for a compound sentence, and you put the comma right here, comma fanboys. Be careful though, because as we talked about, just because a sentence has a fanboys doesn't mean that it needs a comma. For example, Larry and Gary went to the musical together. Those are not independent clauses on either side of the fanboys, so there's not a comma. You only need that comma when it's the pattern independent clause, fanboys, another independent clause. And I think at this point we all know the fanboys, but they are down here if you want to jot those down. Our fifth rule is about front swabbies, and swabbies are just those words that, again, we've been talking about that make clauses dependent or they imply that there's more to the sentence. And typically you see those in complex or compound complex sentences because they have a dependent clause. So the rule is when a complex sentence starts with a swabby, such as since, when, although, because, if, etc., it's going to make that first clause dependent, so you need to place a comma after the dependent clause before the next independent clause. I know that sounded like a lot, so let me show you an example. If I said, because Dave likes bananas, he eats them as often as he can. And No Red Ink likes to call this a swabby, which is fine, but then they call this an independent clause. I almost think it's easier to think of this first part as just all one dependent clause together, because it is. The swabby makes that clause dependent. Because Dave likes bananas, we could not have that on its own. It's a dependent clause. So dependent clause, comma, independent clause. And there's a list of those common swabbies you might see down here that make clauses dependent. So if I were you, I would maybe jot a couple of those down in your notes. The opposite of that rule is when a swabby comes in the middle of a sentence. So the rule is when a swabby is in the middle of a complex sentence or the dependent clause is the second clause in the sentence, you do not use a comma. So let me show you an example again. If we just flipped this sentence, Dave eats bananas as often as he can, the independent clause is first, because he likes them, there's no comma there. And again, I would think of this last part not as a swabby and an independent clause, but just as a dependent clause altogether. I think a really easy way to think of this complex sentence comma rule is just kind of memorizing this formula. So if you have a dependent clause first and then an independent clause, there's always a comma in the middle. If you have the independent clause first and then the dependent clause second, look right here, there's no comma. So dependent, independent, comma. If it's independent, dependent, no comma. Again, that's kind of just one of those formulas that I think if you memorize it, it's easy to remember. Our seventh rule is actually not about necessarily when to use commas, but maybe when not to use commas. And so it's about something called a comma splice, which is when we join two independent clauses by a comma, and we can't do that. So that's kind of our rule that two independent clauses are never allowed to be joined just by a comma. And if you see that, or if you notice you're doing that in your writing, there are three ways that you can fix this. So first of all, you could separate the independent clauses with a semicolon. We learned that last week. Number two, even easier, you can separate the independent clauses with a period and just make them separate sentences. Or number three, you could make it into a compound sentence and add a comma fanboys in between the independent clauses. So let me show you some examples. If we said Dave likes bananas, comma, he eats them as often as he can. That is what we call a comma splice. A comma cannot separate those independent clauses. Or even worse, if you just have these two independent clauses together, Dave likes bananas, he eats them out as often as he can. We need some kind of punctuation there, and you can't just mush those two independent clauses together. So again, here are solutions that I was kind of telling you guys about. We could add a period, we could add a semicolon, or we could add a comma fanboys. I think those are the easiest ways to fix that. And I would say that that's probably one of the most common mistakes I see in your writing. So definitely write those solutions down so that we know how to fix it. All right, rule number 8 is about when commas separate adjectives. And so our rule is that we use a comma between multiple adjectives describing a noun only when the adjectives have equal weight. And I know that sounds kind of confusing. And so on this next slide, there's two kind of tests that you can do to see if adjectives have multiple weight. And I do want you to write those down in your notes because I think that will help you. So sometimes you will see people put commas between adjectives to describe a noun, such as Anne has a loud, smooth, lovely voice. Okay, loud, smooth, and lovely are all describing voice. So to determine if the adjectives have equal weight and should have commas in between them, our first test, which again I would write this down, does the sentence sound natural with the word and between the adjectives? So if I said, Anne has a smooth and lovely and loud voice, that's fine, right? We could do that. That's maybe a little bit um, like long, but that would work. So that indicates to us that we could have commas in between. The second test we do is if the sentence sounds natural after switching the order of the adjectives. So for example, if I switched these and said, Anne has a lovely, loud, and smooth voice, that still sounds natural. So those are our two kind of tests, and we can only put a comma between the adjectives if both answers to those questions are yes. If the sentence sounds natural with the word in between, and if switching the order still sounds natural. If the answer to either of those is no, you don't have a comma between the adjectives. Here's an example of when we wouldn't use a comma. Dave gave me, I think it's supposed to just be 2 purple wool scarves for my birthday. So if I ran our test, David gave me 2 and purple and wool scarves. That doesn't sound right, putting and in between. So we know that there's not going to be commas there. Similarly, if we ran our second test, we can't just switch the order of those. David gave me wool 2 purple scarves. That doesn't make sense. So we don't have commas there. Again, this is just about our tests. So a couple more examples if you want to write those down. And then one very important rule is that you don't ever put a comma between the adjective and the noun that it describes. So if you just have one adjective and then the noun, we're not going to have a comma. Like Lauren wore a warm sweater to school yesterday. That's fine. We just leave that alone. It's only when there's multiple adjectives that we put the comma between the adjectives. All right, our final comma rule is about when we use commas with something called non-restrictive clauses. And I'll tell you what those are in just a minute. But the really easy way to remember this, and the rule I want you to write down, is that if a clause starts with which, you put commas around it. But if a clause starts with the word that, you don't put commas around it. So here are some examples, and I'm going to kind of explain what a non-restrictive clause is. So basically, let's look at this first example. A non-restrictive clause doesn't limit the clause. It's describing all of the adjective, or excuse me, the noun. So if I said the jewels, which cost a lot of money, this part is non-restrictive because it's describing all of the jewels. All of the jewels cost a lot of money. Okay, so that's non-restrictive and we put commas around it. And again, the easy way to remember that is that it starts with which. Okay. However, if we have something called a restrictive clause, which starts with that, we don't have commas around it. And we call it restrictive because it's only describing part of the noun. So similar example, but I've just changed that or which. The jewels that cost a lot of money So now I'm not talking about all of the jewels. I'm restricting it to only the jewels that cost a lot of money, and there we don't put a comma. So fill out your notes, and those are our comma rules.